Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe, and if you're coming back, welcome back. And today I've got a very special guest with me. This is Izzy, and Izzy is currently studying biblical studies, I believe.
Mhm.
Yep. And so today's video, we wanted to have a chat about slavery, which is, a very light, fun topic to get into. But Izzy's done so much work in the past, not only with like biblical studies and things like that, but also on his channel. So if you're interested in his work on slavery and other topics to do with the Bible, his information will be linked in the description box, so you could check that out. And yeah, if you want to give us a rundown of your interests and your background, and yeah, just introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, so I'm Izzy. As she mentioned, I'm a biblical studies major at a Christian university. I started making content mid-August of 2022 and have, you know, tried to improve and stuff like that since. Um, my interest in slavery kind of came about because I think it's a legitimate challenge and wonder. Why does God's holy book have all of this stuff in it? And then, particularly if you're worried at all about doing apologetics to minority groups, this is particularly significant because many of them have been enslaved and had Bible passages used against their ancestors. And so, for example, I grew up actually being told by the black people around me that our skin was as a result of God's curse. So it's a very like this theologically
Mm.
motivated racism uh,
Well,
and justification for slavery is still a very uh, big issue, and so that was also part of the reason why it became a concern for me.
yeah, the people who said that particular thing, were they Christian or
I well, um,
debatable?
yeah, debatable, but that was the perception of the text regardless, was that
Right.
this is what it taught, uh, and that's a result of what people hundreds of years ago thought about, and not even hundreds of years ago. I'm pretty sure the Mormons in the 20th century held that view even still. So
Mm.
we're not too far removed from that sort of stuff. So that obviously, and then even outside of race and ethnicity, you find that how can a good God command, regulate, have whatever slavery in his holy text, and not
Mm.
just like in his holy text, but like so prevalent. It is everywhere, as we'll talk about.
Yes, we will get into that shortly. But the thing that actually sparked this whole idea for the collaboration was someone sent me something on Twitter, or X as it's called now. Okay, so this is an individual called Ocean Keltoy, and for those of you who are not necessarily aware, Keltoy is the old Roman word for Celt. So he's identifying himself as an old pagan, and he hangs out with other pagans, and they make pagan content. So there's no secret. This is like his Norse god altar that he does dedications and worship to. So he's a polytheist and believes in the old pagan religions. So he's kind of mishmashed a few of them together, but mostly like Western European. And this is the dude himself. So he's got Thor's hammer on. Looks like a bit of a skinhead. Don't let that deceive you. He's not like, uh, a neo. You know what? He's probably more uh, left leaning, I would say, from what he posts on Twitter. So very, very what you might call woke. And so this particular one down the bottom here, he retweeted something that someone else tweeted. And his comment is Christians say slavery is wrong, challenge failed. So what he retweeted was slavery is not in and of itself wrong. The form matters. Man stealing is forbidden, yet the Christian is rightfully a slave of Christ. So we're going to unpack what that means and why, um, the pagans obviously have some issues with it, even though these Norse gods that he's worshipping, the people that he's referencing, the Vikings, they were heavily into slavery. They enslaved many different populations wherever they went and trafficked human beings quite a bit. So it's interesting that he's like really into these pagan gods and yet has the point of view that like slavery is wrong and seems to think that Christianity is the problem rather than just like a cultural thing of slavery is wrong. And I used to come across this a lot when I was in paganism myself. And it's one of the things that I guess kind of drew me towards it because I was trying to make sense of my own background because I'm mixed race. And so my background is like, Celtic and European, but also native Fijian and also Indian. And the Indian population that went to Fiji were indentured servants. So they were essentially sold the idea of enslaving themselves for a certain period of time until they paid off the debt. And then they were, free to do whatever they wanted after that. So it's basically what happened after slavery was abolished. They moved into a model called indentured servitude, which wasn't like kidnapping people and generationally keeping them prisoner for life and their children and their children's children and that sort of thing. It was very limited and they had to agree to it. So that's like my background. And when I went into paganism, I was trying to find like my identity as a mixed race person. Um, and in paganism, they always say, like, oh, Christianity came in and they destroyed all these cultures. Christianity came in and they wiped out the identities of these different people. But it's a bit more complicated than that because, as I mentioned, some of my ancestry is native Fijian, and they are quite happily Christian these days. And it has stopped them from doing cannibalism. So there's some like give and take in this. And yeah, I will kick that hot potato over to you, Izzy, and just get your perspective on like what exactly is the Bible talking about when it talks about slavery? Because I think there's a mixture in there. It's not just one model of slavery that they used.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So, what in you find slavery in the Old and the New Testament. Now, obviously, this covers a very long period of time, so slavery is seen as different things in the text. There's also some discussion about the term slave itself, because, say, a high-ranking person in the ancient Near East could be called a slave to the king, even though he wasn't a slave in the sense that we're going to be talking about in this video. So it's kind of like the term power. Like if I said Goku is powerful from Dragon Ball Z, and I said God is powerful, and I said the president of the United States is powerful, I'm using the same term, but I mean very different things by these. So we have to keep that in mind. So, for the purposes of this section where we're talking about different forms of slavery throughout the biblical text, we can define slavery as a condition in which someone or their labor rights is owned by another person. With that being the case, we can see that there is debt slavery or indentured servitude. This is the kind of slavery where someone works off debt via labor. Rules for this change based on the society's laws at the time. So debt slavery is going to look different depending upon the ancient Near Eastern society. In the Old Testament and in ancient Israel, you can find laws for debt slavery in Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15. Chattel slavery is another kind of slavery presented in the Hebrew Bible, and we see this in Leviticus 25:44 through 46. This is distinguished from debt slavery for a few reasons. One, people don't enter into chattel slavery because of debt or poverty or anything like that. They enter into it, or rather, they are in this institution probably not by choice, for a different reason. Uh, Oftentimes, foreigners made up this category of slavery, of slave in the ancient Near East, and so there were different laws for foreigners, for foreign slaves. And a big difference that we see in Leviticus 25 and in the ancient Near East is that these slaves were permanent, and children could also be a part of debt slavery, yes, but also permanent chattel slavery.
Mm.
So
So
those are the two most represented in the Hebrew Bible specifically. You do find other things. So if you move outside the Mosaic Law and just look at the Hebrew Bible in general, you will probably find what we would term sex slavery. So the situation with Hagar could be an example of this. It's kind of complicated because we have these categories like wife, concubine, sex slave, prostitute, and depending on the society, the lines that distinguish these terms can get kind of blurred. Um, but we do see sex slavery in the ancient Near East, and it is possible that, again, depending on how you understand the term and how you're going to define how the ancient people might have seen it versus how we're going to see it, Hagar could be an example of that. Another one is corvée labor. So this corvée labor is seen in the book of Exodus and during Solomon's reign. So the corvée labor was a kind of thing in which people were tasked to do big building projects. So we
mm,
see this in Egypt where the Israelites are enslaved and they're forced to build these things for Egypt. And then later with King Solomon, we see that he does a similar thing with foreigners in ancient Israel to build God's temple, and that's considered corvée labor. Now, moving into the New Testament, Roman slavery is the
mm,
cultural frame of reference for the New Testament biblical authors. In Roman slavery, by this point, debt slavery does not really exist. Bonner
mm,
makes a note of this. He says, rather, some people were temporarily enslaved to pay off their debts, speaking of the Old Testament. However, this is not the case for all people enslaved in the ancient Near East, and certainly not under the late Roman Republic and early Roman Empire, where millions were trafficked and forced into labor in domestic, urban, and agricultural settings. So the when the New Testament is using the term slave of Christ or slave of God, there is an Old Testament referent for that, like the people of God are considered God's slaves, and that's consistent across both testaments. But for the biblical authors writing in a Roman culture, their immediate frame of reference is going to be Roman slavery. And we actually see this due to the Greek terms and things like that that they use in order to describe the relationship that we have to Christ. So
Hmm.
those are the different kinds of slavery that you'll see. One that we might see is temple slavery. So that was one that definitely happened in ancient areas where slaves would um, work at the temple of a divine being, of a
Is that
deity.
more of a pagan thing?
It certainly happened across the ancient Near East.
Mm,
I think it's very possible that that happened in ancient Israel. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't have happened. We know based upon the Mosaic law that a priest could have slaves. Now
right.
they may be household slaves,
Mm.
so they so in the priest's home he's going to have a wife, children, and a slave. But it is again possible, especially because, like I said, we know that Solomon used corvée laborers, specifically told he did in the text. So
Mm.
it is also very possible that uh, temple slaves existed in
Yeah.
ancient Israel as well. But
But they probably wouldn't be doing any of the rituals or anything like that,
no, no,
'cause that's part of the priesthood. Uh,
yeah, there are certain things that only the priests would be doing.
yeah.
Definitely.
With temple slaves in, like, the more pagan countries like, Greece and Rome, they would be, like a mixture of priestess, priest, and also sex slave?
Uh, That's possible. I don't know as much about Roman slavery because a lot of my focus currently has been with regards to the Hebrew Bible because that's where you might say most of the objections come from,
Right, yeah.
if from non-believers, and understandably so. So that's where a lot of my focus has been, but we do find that Roman culture in general, but also Roman slavery, yeah, would have been very sexual. We see again sex slavery in the ancient Near East. We literally have documents where this guy is asking for a female slave, make sure you check her fertility, and I want her for my lap. Not to get into all the weeds of that, but
Okay.
yeah. So that in the we see that in the ancient areas. When it comes to Roman slavery in the first century, we definitely see a very sexual culture, and
Mm,
so I see no reason why. Um, and as far as I understand, slaves would have been seen as bodies,
mm.
um, that
For
y
multi-purpose uses.
yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, 'cause there was, and I can't remember where it was, it's in one of the Corinthians, I think, where Paul was rebuking people for, using prostitutes, and, it seemed to be implied that it was part of, like, temple culture or just regular,
Uh,
uh,
yeah,
life in that regard in the pagan world.
yeah, so people have talked about this with regards to the background to what gives rise to Paul's sexual ethic, but it was accepted that a
Mm,
man was gonna go cheat. It was a it was very accepted that a man, uh, of course, the woman shouldn't do this, but it was very accepted that the man could just
mhm,
go see a prostitute if he wanted to.
mm,
Um, so yeah, this would have been a very if Paul wants to hold to a uh, the Jewish sexual ethic of his time, railing against this prostitution would have been something that would have been important for him. And as you mentioned, he does in Corinthians as well as other sexual vices.
yeah, so This probably leads us to the next question of what is a slave of Christ and what type of slave are we talking about? And is it bad?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if this would make someone uncomfortable. I mean, we're talking about how Romans would see slaves as just bodies for multiple purposes. And we're talking about how ancient Near Eastern people viewed slaves and, you know, beatings and sexual usage and all these sorts of things. But we want to consider ourselves slaves of Christ.
Mhm.
That does not sound good. That sounds like a terrible analogy for what's going on. Why can't we just stick to the analogy of children? We are God's child. He is our
Mm,
divine father. Uh, well, unfortunately, well, I'm going to say fortunately, given what we're going to say here in a moment about what it means to be a slave of Christ. But Paul mentions in Romans 6 that he is using this analogy because of the limited human understanding. But
mm,
uh, slavery was everywhere in the ancient world. Like this idea that we have this fundamental right that, if lived out, will cause us to reject the institution of slavery just did not exist. Um,
mm.
like we know, the oldest known society was the Mesopotamian and Sumerian civilizations. And they had slaves between 6000 BC and 2000 BC. We know they had slaves. The oldest known written reference to slavery is in 1754 BC. And then, obviously, like we just talked about, this continues.
Mm.
Judaism, Jewish people have slaves in the first century. We know this to be the case as well.
It's
It's,
almost a given,
yeah,
like,
yeah,
it's standard practice everywhere.
right. Now, that
Mm.
doesn't justify it, okay?
No.
Slavery's wrong,
Mm.
but, and this is, I'm not gonna defend that. Like, it
No.
should be assumed to be the case. But, um, this was not the thought of excuse me. This is not the thought of ancient Israel, this wasn't the thought of the ancient Near East, and this wasn't the thought of a lot of the Roman Empire. So, given that, in their cultural context, referring to the relationship between God and the church as a kind of slavery makes just as much sense to them as the relationship between a father and a child, a husband and a wife.
Mm.
All of these analogies would have made sense to an ancient person. So, given that, what does it mean to be a slave of Christ? Well, paradoxically, slavery to Christ is freedom, and particularly moral freedom. So, Kruse, in his commentary on Romans, says to be a slave of righteousness clearly has an ethical sense, being the opposite of being a slave to sin. But people can become slaves to righteousness only if they have become slaves of God. Slavery to God, paradoxically, is genuine freedom. This is because slavery to Christ, as pointed out in Romans 6, causes sanctification and eternal life, which lead to moral perfection and incorruptibility, as Paul points out with regards to the resurrection and the end times in 1 Corinthians 15.
Mm.
So, slavery to Christ is moral freedom.
It's, reminding me of, a video that I did a little while ago, which was, what is freedom and what does it mean to actually be free? So it was kinda looking at different philosophies about freedom and how, there's freedom which is sustainable and there is freedom which is unsustainable.
Mm,
And freedom where you just go absolutely nuts and do whatever the hell you want
mhm,
is not sustainable because, you will burn out, you will kill yourself, you will kill other people, you
right.
will rain down destruction on your own life and on other people's lives. And sustainable freedom is essentially moral freedom, where, you have parameters and you have limitations, and you work
Yeah.
within those parameters and limitations, in order to have sustainable freedom, so freedom that never ends.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm gonna agree with that, and even argue that those limitations will cause human flourishing. not flourishing in the sense of that everyone will be ultimately happy emotionally all the time, but
Mm,
flourishing as in we'll be in a moral state of being by which we can flourish. The second point to make is that slavery to Christ has physical ramifications. Uh, it is written, "You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of men." 1 Corinthians 7:23. The reason why Christians should not be slaves physically is because of the redemptive work of the cross. This is similar to the vision that is expressed in the Old Testament, which is that God's people should not be enslaved. And
mm,
if you want more information on that, I wrote a exegetical paper on Leviticus 25:44 through 46, but the that you can check out. But the argument there is that they have become slaves to God. The people of God have become slaves to God, so it is improper for them to be slaves in this way. Now, this is a vision that is expressed in the Old Testament. This is not something that is realized in the Old Testament. And
mm,
we see this because even chattel slavery is something that in ancient Hebrew uh, could become under his choice, of course. But there are two provisions given for when a Hebrew could become a chattel slave. And obviously, they could become debt slaves. And then if you read Exodus 21, we see that um, in that in that context, female slaves are uh, treated a bit differently because they're probably being sold off into marriage of some kind. But um, be that as it may, uh, we see that the people of God are enslaved. But Paul in the New Covenant makes this point more expressly clear because of the redemptive work of Christ. This theological spiritual thing, it has physical ramifications. We shouldn't become slaves.
mm,
Now, as we're going to talk about later, not only in the New Testament but also later in church history, we did become slaves. But this vision that Paul expresses again is something that we and again is also expressed in the old covenant is something that we should work towards. The third point to make is that slavery to Christ has eschatological significance. So we're told in Romans 6, but now that you have been freed from sin and enslaved to God, the fruit you have leads to sanctification and the end is eternal life. So Jude also expresses this idea that the loyal slave will receive the mercy of the benevolent master, but the disloyal receive the due penalty from him. And I'll
mm,
get to that more. And you can see that more in Bonner's work on reading Jude in light of slavery in the Roman world. But slavery to Christ again has a eschatological significance. It leads to eternal life and mercy from the again benevolent master. And number four, an interesting point here is that this actually shows that Jesus is God.
mm.
So Bonner points out the fact that the language of slavery in Jude affects his Christology. Jude makes Christ Israel's redeemer in Exodus, verse 5, and the one coming with the holy ones, which is uh,
That second
possibly
coming.
right, which is possibly a quote of 1 Enoch chapter 1 verse 9 where God is coming with the holy ones. And you can see that in verses 14 and 15. This, coupled with the insertion of Christ as a slave master, which is imagery that is used for God in the Old Testament, points to Jesus being the one true God. And so,
Mm,
uh, this language affects our Christology as well. And this language props up Christ as this benevolent deity who will take care of his loyal subjects, let's say.
mm. Yeah. And slavery isn't like the end point for the Christian journey. It's sort of like the beginning phase of sanctification, leading towards adoption and towards the status of a child and an heir to God's kingdom.
Yeah, there's certainly there are there's all kinds of language across both testaments to express how we should view our relationship to God. So
Mm.
slavery is one of them, marriage is one of them, children is one of them, um, both human and animal children. So God is likened to an animal who protects her cubs, for example. Mother, God is actually depicted as a great mother
Hmm.
in places in the Hebrew Bible.
Like a
And
hen that has chicks under the wings.
right, yeah,
Mm.
uh, we're Christ's friends, right? We're his family. Um, so all kinds of language is used. Uh, we are servants of the King, right? Um, yeah, so yeah, all kinds of languages used, and all kinds of languages is certainly valid. Even language that genders God differently.
Which doesn't mean that God is a woman. It just means
No,
that there's
no,
different analogies.
yeah, yes. Although there certainly is a fun discussion that could be had about the gender of God. So we see that the church fathers, for example, they described uh, God and Christ as both like he's both male and female, but also not male and female. um, I
Probably doesn't necessarily have a gender.
Yeah, right. Um, I remember I quoted in one of my theology talk videos. I quote a church father who says that um, Christ is all to his children, basically, both
Mm.
father and mother, teacher and nurse. And so uh, all of these analogies are I think driving at one singular ideal, which is that to us, God is all and in all and through all.
Yeah, so, what would you say it means to be, a slave of Christ?
Well, I can sum up the 4 points that I just made. Uh, so slavery to Christ uh, means that for us, it means that we have moral freedom. We should not become slaves of men,
Mhm.
and that we will have a bright, blessed
Like
destiny in the age to come, you might
mm,
say. Now, for our view of Christ, it means that he is God. I'm going to argue, again, given the language.
mm.
So, in terms of how we view Christ, we see him as God. In terms of how we view ourselves, we shouldn't become slaves of men. We have moral freedom and we have a bright future to come.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think about, like, how that would play out in people's day-to-day lives, like, how do you live as a bond servant of Christ? Is it a case of saying that, like, you have no other authority, or that you must do whatever it is that Christ asks of you?
Yeah, yeah, that is a good question. The given the language that we find in Jude, again, the language is language of the loyal servant. Several of Jesus' parables actually also do this. Several of Jesus' parables characterize believers as slaves
Mm,
to someone, and believers are seen as loyal slaves and good slaves. So, what it would mean practically in your daily life is to pursue virtue that
mm,
demonstrates loyalty to him. And so I always like to bring it back to virtue because if you check out my writings and other things, you'll see that I am a virtue ethicist. I believe that the goal of life, obviously, the goal of life is union with God, but we should strive for the development of excellent moral character. And that is part of what it means to be a slave to Christ, is to strive for that moral excellence, that righteousness.
Mm,
And there are several ways we can pursue the three theological virtues as pointed out by the Apostle Paul and Thomas Aquinas: faith, hope, and love, right? There are many ways in which we can pursue those practically, and especially love. One way is just demonstrate that in your Christian community. uh, Show your Christian community love. That's what First John points out. The opponents of First John are people who are characterized as not loving, and
mm,
what particularly they do not love is the community that they were in.
mm.
And so that is one way practically that you can do that, is get involved in a Christian community in which you can demonstrate love for other people.
Yep. And also, I guess within your home life as well.
Yeah. Yep. You can, yeah, obviously love is something that the Christian love is not something that stops at Christians, right? So,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely.
And, it's funny, like, observing some Christians because they'll do the love at church, and then go home and not show that love to their family. And it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
needs to be across the board.
Right. Right. It certainly needs to be across the board. Virtue virtue ethicists talk about embodiment, where a virtuous person, um, like an honest person, right?
Mm,
Let's take that as an example. An honest person doesn't just tell the truth occasionally,
mm,
right? Right. Someone who is honest embodies honesty. And
mm,
and under virtue ethics, honesty permeates their being. So they want honest friends, they want honest children, they feel um, uh, disdain towards dishonesty.
mm,
They want to tell the truth as much as they can. Um, but there's also a balance too.
mm.
So virtue ethicists have been known for using this example, and others have as well. If the Jews obviously come, or if the certain group of people come knocking at your door asking for where the Jews are, you lie to them, right? A-
Yeah,
And,
kinda like the example of, Rahab in the Bible where she hid
right,
people and then lied to the authorities about where they were.
yeah, it is almost the same. It's a very similar situation, yeah.
Mm,
And you're not demonstrating virtue in that. You are demonstrating virtue because you're showing your desire to protect innocent life.
mm,
So, uh, virtue ethics also requires moral wisdom. We have the virtues. You should embody um, honesty, but if you're too honest, you'll tell people things that they ought not know,
mhm.
that you don't have no business telling other people, and that could actually get people unalived. Right.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
you should be a courageous person. That, right? Courage is a virtue. In fact, the Greeks, when they were talking about virtue ethics, courage was one of the things that they lifted up.
Mm,
But someone too courageous or too brave might not think about what they're doing before they just charge headlong into a given situation, and it might be disastrous for everyone involved.
yeah.
So moral wisdom is needed to uh, figure out what the right thing to do is in a given situation. and
Mm,
and virtue ethics, typically, one of the ways that we go about thinking about this is moral exemplars. So who in our life, in our media, demonstrates or embodies a virtue, a characteristic. So this could be, if we want to think about fictional examples, this could be Superman. So
mhm.
depending on the depiction of Superman, he embodies Judeo-Christian ethics. He embodies truth, justice, and the American way. Uh, those sorts of things. Batman, right, he can embody justice. hope, right? Those sorts of things.
Mm.
Uh, I referenced Goku earlier. Goku, he embodies power, but also um, uh, courage, strength, and other things that are heroic. Real life people. I mean, whether or not these people like were all the way great people is one thing,
It's
right?
it's kinda hard to be perfect.
Right, yeah,
Mm.
but, Martin Luther King Jr., right,
Mhm.
embodies, embodies certain things. Mother Teresa embodies certain things. Uh, Now, Christian virtue ethics has basically said, "This is Christ," right? Our moral
Mm.
exemplar is a perfect human being.
Mhm.
And so and this kind of way of thinking is explicit in the text of scripture, uh, where Paul in Philippians 2, he wants the Philippian church to be humble. Why? Because God himself humbled himself. Right? Jesus didn't just
Mm.
walk the walk. God doesn't just or talk the talk, excuse me, and say, "Yeah, I'm a very humble person." He also
He wasn't a humble bragger.
right. He also he demonstrates that
Mm.
by that, we are told to love as, Christ loves, right? So for Christian virtue ethicists, Jesus Christ is the moral exemplar and the embodiment of virtue. So
Mm.
we do, like, as tongue in cheek as it is, and as memeable as it is now, we
Mhm.
do legitimately ask the question, what would Jesus do?
Mm.
um,
Mhm.
so
As his slaves, we we ask
right,
ourselves.
right. So
Mm.
practically, being a slave of Christ in your daily life means asking, what would Jesus do? What would this great person do in this situation? And do that,
Mm.
right? And but to figure that out, of course, we should study the scriptures and use our moral wisdom in order
Mm.
to decide what the right action is in a given situation.
Okay, well, I guess this begs the question of how have Christians actually lived this out historically? Because I think you were saying before we started, it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, it is a incredibly mixed bag. So I looked at I looked at church history from roughly 90 AD, depending on how you date some of these texts, to roughly 200 AD. So I
Mm.
looked at that time period and said, okay, what were Christians doing with the concept of slavery at this time? Now, keep in mind, of course, Christians are persecuted. They're the minority, right? They are
Mhm.
the oppressed minority in this context.
Yeah, they're not the power at
Right.
that time. Yeah.
Right. Which I think is really important if I were to take a quick side tangent for both New Testament and
Mm.
early church discussions regarding slavery, is that we know that when slave revolts occurred, Rome put the brakes on that. They crucified slaves. They did all
Mm.
sorts of other things. This is a very rated R but very historically accurate TV series. Spartacus
Oh,
is a
yeah, I love
is
that.
is a good example of this actual
So
historical.
so violent.
Yeah,
So naked.
yes, yes, but and obviously dramatized, but it is historically accurate. Rome
Mm.
would have killed Christians if they revolted in this way. So this is why in the biblical text, Paul will say, again, he says, do not become slaves of men, right? Like he doesn't want this,
Mm.
but at the end of the day, PM and Peter and others still say, slaves, be obedient to your masters because they're worried that the teachings of God will be reviled and that Rome is going to persecute the church worse,
Mm.
um, which is a legitimate concern. Paul is literally concerned about these people's lives and how their God is going to be
Glorified.
seen, right?
Yeah.
Which is a very legitimate concern.
Mm.
So, and the early church still has this concern. So they are the persecuted minorities. Their funds are limited. They don't have the power to just do whatever they want. That said, though, let's look at some of these texts. So we know that Christians were trying to release slaves and take care of them very early on.
Mhm.
So, like literally, the first Clement was is seen as written around 90 to like 105, 110 AD. I've seen Clement traditionally is seen as the Bishop of Rome during this time. Tradition has it that this Clement might be the Clement that Paul references in one of his letters. So, First Clement, Clement of Rome says, "We know that many among us gave themselves up into bonds that they might deliver others. Many have given themselves up into slavery, and having received their own price, have therewith fed others." So, this is this is really remarkable. Like, this
Mm.
is again 90 to 110 AD. We know that Christians are not only freeing slaves, but becoming slaves to help other slaves,
Mm.
uh, which is very
So it's a
powerful.
pretty radical way of going about it. Like, essentially, like send yourself to prison to free prisoners.
Right, right. Yeah, that might be a good analogy. Like you can't just storm into every prison in the United States and topple over this criminal justice structure that we have going on. But what you
Mm.
can do is work within it, and that is, I think, what the New Testament authors and then as well as the early church is trying to do to
Mm.
greater or lesser degrees. Now, a second point to make is that slave masters were seen as symbols of God. So
Mhm.
the Didache, again, Didache is also like 90 to 120 AD. So also a really early text. It says, "You shall not give orders to your male or female slave who hopes in the same God as you when you are angry, lest they cease to fear the God who is over you both. For he comes to call with uh, not with regard to reputation, but those whom the Spirit has prepared. And you slaves, be submissive to your masters in respect and fear, as to a symbol of God." And
Mhm.
so here we find a similar idea that you see in the New Testament. Uh, Masters should treat their slaves well because, um,
They're also the property of God.
yeah, so uh, because they're both Christians, so they both hope in the same God as you, right? Is the phrase. So the Didache is imagining a situation where the master and the slave are both Christians. So the idea is that you should not mistreat your Christian slave.
A fellow, yeah, a fellow Christian,
Right.
not just your slave, but a fellow,
r-
believer.
Right. Now,
Mm.
again, this still doesn't get us to where we need to go, though, because one, this isn't a text calling for the abolition of slavery, right?
Yeah.
Two, obviously, slave and master both are seen as Christians, and that's not seen as a problem at all. A third thing to note is that the master is seen as a symbol of God, right?
Mm.
Which, given the slave language that we just went over, that does make sense in, if you given the mind and what we just went over of the ancient authors and stuff. So it doesn't get us to where we need to go, but the idea is that because you two are both Christians, the relationship and the way that this works needs to change, which is relevant and also
Mm.
pointed out in Paul. So in the book of Philemon, right? This is literally Paul's letter to a slave master, and Paul tells the slave master to receive Onesimus no longer as a slave but as a brother. Right?
Mm.
The He probably did not uh, set Onesimus free. Paul didn't set Onesimus free, but the idea is that this gospel that we've both accepted has fundamentally altered this relationship. So that is relevant, but it still doesn't get us to where we need to go. And this is why in both testaments, And what we see here, the covenant people get special treatment, right?
Mhm.
Um, the people of God should not be slaves. Why? Because they're people of God. What about everybody else?
Yeah.
Right. Now, there was a book recently that I'm gonna quote actually here in a little bit that talks about this and says that this question of what to do with non-believing slaves or slave masters would not have been that relevant because in Rome, slaves were usually in households. And usually,
Mm.
when one person adopted a religion in the household, the entire household adopted it.
Especially the head of the household.
Right, right.
Mm.
So if so particularly if the husband converted to Christianity, everyone else would. So this probably would not have been much of an issue. We
Mm.
today would see it as an issue, obviously, because we're like, I mean, my
Autonomy, free will.
right, my
Yeah.
mom's a Jew, my dad's Catholic, and I'm Protestant. Like, what's happening here? But that's not would have been happening in households in the ancient world.
Mm.
The Epistle of Barnabas, so this claims to be written by the Apostle Barnabas. It's also been dated early. Some people have tried to date this to 70 AD. So this
Mm.
is also really early. And it pretty much makes the same argument the Didache does. Be submissive to your masters in respect and fear as to a symbol of God. Do not give orders to your male and female slaves when angry, and so on. So, you know,
Seems like those beliefs were fairly consistent throughout ancient churches.
yeah, yeah, I'm gonna
Mm.
say that what we find in the New Testament does play itself out in the early church. A third point to make is that, obviously Christians were slaves, right? We've talked about this already, but it's actually
Mhm.
really interesting. So, Callistus rose to power in the early church, and he was a slave who became the Bishop of Rome in 217. uh,
Mhm.
Jerome, and later on, makes an interesting point. He says, one of his charges is that we have allowed a slave to be ordained, yet he himself has clergymen of the same class. So it's interesting. Whoever Jerome is talking to is complaining that they've allowed a slave to become ordained in the church, but he points out the hypocrisy in saying, you have
You're ordaining
slaves.
slaves.
Right. Uh, and then he also says, and he must have read of Onesimus, the book of Philemon,
Mm.
who, being made regenerate by Paul in prison from a slave, became a deacon. So he argues that the slave that Paul is talking about in the book of Philemon becomes a deacon of the church.
Mm.
A non-Christian source, Pliny the Younger, he was persecuting Christians and he writes about his persecutions. He says, since it was really necessary to be sure that we had the credible truth, we tortured two female slaves who were said to be ministers. But nothing was found except that they believed in enormous and distorted superstition. So I adjured the proceedings in order to turn to you for advice. So, not only do we have female ministers, which what the heck does he mean by minister, and how does that relate
Mm.
to certain conversations today?
Yeah.
But they're also female slaves.
Mm.
So, and this from a non-Christian source. So we absolutely know that this happened in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Um, Now, an unfortunate reality as well is that Christians weren't just slaves, but they had slaves. So Athenagorius, in one of his writings, says very explicitly, "We, the church, Christians, have slaves. Some more, some fewer." And he goes on to say that not even these slaves are making these outrageous, superstitious claims that people are making about the faith. So he breezes over this fact. They don't have a problem with Christians having slaves necessarily.
Mm.
They just some Christian writings just want it to be uh, qualified. That said, though, there was actually a book recently that was made on the topic of slavery in church history. Uh, and thankfully, due to my university's resources, I was able to get part of this book and read a chapter of it. And in this scholar's summary of the early church on slavery, the following is said: "It was to be expected that those who could afford it, including Christian bishops, would have slaves to wait on them. Those who were unfortunate enough to be slaves were expected to be obedient. While slave owners were exhorted to treat their slaves well, the limits of acceptable behavior towards a slave extended so far as to include torture as the only reliable way of obtaining legal evidence from a servile witness. Not only were the Christian moral teachings about slaves unexceptional, but also the fact that the Bishop of Samaria was a slave owner seems to have been unexceptional as well." Uh,
Mm,
Now, there's more in church history. There's obviously more in church history to talk about. Some interesting comments have been made about Gregory of Nyssa's criticism of slavery, and you guys can
mm,
check out this video here for that.
Because what separates Gregory is he's not just saying that the abuse of slaves is wrong, he's saying the idea of slavery is wrong. That is very rare in the ancient world. There's only a couple places you find that, and nothing as scathing as Gregory. And what brought Gregory to that conviction is the doctrine of creation in the image of God. He's basically saying you can't put a price tag on God. And if we're made in God's image, then how could you possibly think you can own someone? And we take this kind of thinking for granted today. What we have to appreciate is how radical that was in the fourth century. Even Kyle Harper, in this fantastic book he's written, who qualifies this a bit, still acknowledges that this sermon is the only extant critique of slavery to survive from antiquity. And he calls it by far the most remarkable and categorical statement of opposition to slavery in the ancient world. Now, it's that same doctrine, fast forward 1,500 years, that, or 14 or whatever, is creation in the image of God, that doctrine that is driving the abolitionist movement. This is what people like William Wilberforce and other evangelical Christians are appealing to in that context. And it's not generally disputed that it was Christians who were leading the charge. Alec Reary has this excellent book on Protestantism. He's very honest. It's a very good resource. He's honest, showing Christians on both sides of the struggle. But he's right when he claims that abolitionism was a religious movement first and last. If you want a flavor of the logic and the appeal that's being made, my favorite sentence in all of this topic is Frederick Douglass's logic, where he says, "There can no more be a law for the enslavement of man made in the image of God than for the enslavement of God himself."
So obviously, we can acknowledge the radical nature of Gregory of Nyssa's comments on
mm,
slavery. It is pretty scathing. Dr. Gavin Orland there of Truth Unites that I played, he did a sermon on this and has talked about this, and I would encourage you guys to check him out. He's a good resource on things. But
mm,
now, I don't want to overstate the case. Gregory of Nyssa is epic.
mm.
He's a really lonely voice. um,
Right.
People around him don't view it the same way.
Mm,
Augustine is one of the most influential theologians in all of Christian history, and he does not condemn slavery at all. In fact, he uses like the language of slavery to describe the creation order, and he does some other things as well. Just John Chrysostom comes close, but he doesn't get there because for him,
mm.
the institution is not the problem, it's greedy people. He's like, uh
Like, the character of people is the issue.
yeah, so he's
Yeah.
kinda like, why do you guys have 4 slaves? Like, that's a little excessive, don't you think? Why don't you just stick it to 1 or 2? He's concerned with greed. So, now there's a little bit more to it than that. You guys can check out. There are some really cool, freely available resources from scholars about the history of Christianity on slavery, both in the South, but also in the early church. And if you look up John Chrysostom, Augustine, and others,
Mm.
you can check that out.
I mean,
Christianity, the First 1,000 Years, was a book that was written by Eastern Orthodox Christian, and he has a section on slavery and Augustine, Chrysostom, and others. But
yeah, I mean, Augustine has plenty of different issues as far as I'm concerned. I mean, he basically went back to Gnosticism towards the end there.
There is a lot that can be said about him, for sure. But yeah, so it
In
go
in
ahead.
terms of Gregory, now you might know this, you might not. So feel free to just say, I don't know.
Mhm.
But how was Gregory's point of view received generally?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. Yeah, I don't know. I
It's
am
unknown. Yeah.
I myself am not sure. Um, it could have fallen on deaf ears. It kind of depends, because I mean, we know that uh Christians had slaves at the time that he's criticizing the institution.
Mm,
If I'm not mistaken, we have Christian symbols on things that would have run around the necks of slaves from the 4th century, because
right.
by this point, obviously the Roman Empire and Christianity are starting to converge a
Mm.
little bit more in terms
It's
of.
becoming a state religion.
Right. So
Mm.
that line is starting to be blurred here. So um and that's no fault of like Constantine or anything
No.
like that, as much the conspiracy theorists want you to think it is. Um but
He decriminalized it, but he didn't institutionalize it.
yeah, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Um I mean, it didn't help that he put the cross on Roman soldiers, but yeah, that's unfortunate. But anyway, so obviously that line is starting to be blurred during this time. So we do see Christians using the state to manumit slaves, because Ignatius of Antioch,
Mm.
going way back to like 110 AD, was like, you know, we could do this with church funds, but we probably shouldn't do it too much because we have only limited funds. We're not in a great position here. We need to be careful, all that sort of stuff.
Was that like buying slaves and freeing them?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, using funds to free slaves. Now,
Yeah.
but that becomes less of a concern when you have the arm of the state on your side. Uh,
Mm.
uh, so uh, we find a text from like Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century, 7th century. Uh,
So
he
different Gregory.
Right, yeah, yeah, different Gregory, not Gregory of Nyssa. He says he bases him freeing these slaves uh on the idea of the incarnation. So he says, since our Redeemer, the maker of every creature, vouchsafed to assume human flesh for this end, that the chains of slavery wherewith we were held, being broken by the grace of his divinity, he might restore us to pristine liberty. It is a salutary deed of men whom nature originally produced free, and whom the law of nations has subject to the yoke of slavery, be restored by the benefit of manumission to the liberty in which you were born. So his
Mm.
his wanting to free these slaves is based upon his theology, of course, similar to
Mm.
Gregory of Nyssa. But like I said, it's a mixed bag. We could always talk about more. I mean, the Acts of Thomas, which was written 200 to 250 AD, it
Mm.
literally depicts a situation where, and I'm not like, this isn't a this is like literally happening. Uh
Mm.
Jesus, the son of Joseph the carpenter, uh, buys a slave, uh, and it's Thomas. Like he um
So
uh
is this a text that's like a legitimate source? It's not like the Gospel of Thomas.
well, I don't know if the Acts of Thomas. I don't think the Acts of Thomas is a Gnostic text.
Okay. It's just
But
checking.
yeah, but obviously it was written 200 to
Way after.
250 AD, right? So it wasn't
Yeah.
written by Thomas.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, you know, it says here, so saying he showed him Thomas afar off and agreed with him for 3 litrae of silver unstamped, and wrote a deed of sale, saying, I, Jesus, the son of Joseph the carpenter, acknowledge that I have sold my slave, Judas by name, unto thee, Abanus, a merchant of uh, Gundaforus, king of the Indians. So yeah, I mean, Jesus literally is a slave owner, and does that. Um, this is not to say anything about the depictions of Christ as a slave.
Mm.
So Philippians 2:7 uses the Greek term doulos, right? Slave, servant, to describe Jesus as humbling. Jesus himself, washed the feet of the disciples,
Mm.
and demonstrates a slave
See,
mentality.
the model is like he willingly made himself a slave.
Right. Yep.
It's that sort of model of like going into slavery to free the slaves.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Uh, the Shepherd of Hermas, also a very early Christian text, also depicts him as a slave. So yeah, there's a lot going on with that. So yeah, in church history again, it's a mixed bag, and then of course we know early American history where
Mm.
you had yeah, you have to be fair and honest here. You had Christians on both sides. The
Yeah.
abolitionist movement was a very theologically motivated movement, but so was the antebellum South. I mean,
Mm.
they even tried to establish laws that sound similar to the Old Testament laws on slavery. They tried to have limitations on beatings, for example. They beat them anyway, but they
They limited them, which
uh,
is
legally
very
limited,
good.
yeah, legally
So,
limited them, not functionally, let's say.
right.
Um, but yeah, so Philemon was a
Mm.
text that was used. It was literally brought in front of people as an example of the fact that the church should not be freeing slaves; they should be giving them back to their masters. So if a slave
Although,
runs away,
yeah, the context of Philemon is that, like, at the time, he had legal rights, and so it wasn't that it was good or right. It's just that, legally speaking, for Paul to go against that would be him breaking the law. So he was appealing to Philemon as a brother in Christ to do the right thing,
yeah,
not to deny him what he could legally demand.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that was sort of how he was handling that situation at the time.
yeah, yep.
Yeah,
So uh so yeah, I made a video for Black History Month talking about this other really important thing that you find is that both sides of the debate uh, in early American history about slavery were actually misusing the text. So
right.
obviously one side way more than the other, but it was actually both. So
Hmm.
the um the slaveholders tried to use Leviticus 25, 44 to 46 to say, we can have slaves. Um Obviously that was for Israel, different time, God's accommodating, stuff like that. This is a bunch of hermeneutical issues we're trying to apply that to
Yeah.
today's
I
context
mean,
aside from moral issues.
there's a bunch of things in the old law which was God accommodating cultural norms rather than like straight up just abolishing all these things, like, for example, polygamy.
Polygamy, patriarchy, bunch of
Yeah.
different things,
So,
yeah.
I mean, Jesus talked specifically about things like polygamy. Like he said, God created them man and woman, and it was, a bonding of just two people, and it wasn't open for like several wives.
Right. Yeah,
um, but Moses was given allowances to deal with human nature,
yeah, yeah,
which is the problem.
yeah, right. So you find them using that text. The curse of Ham is also one, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video. I mean, black people are apparently cursed with black skin. It was actually interesting because I discovered that it's actually like their interpretation of Genesis 9 is actually worse than that. So they thought so the slave owners would try to argue that Noah, because at the end of this situation with his nakedness and whatever, Noah
Mm,
eh, pronounces a curse and a blessing, right? And uh the slave owners thought that Shem, right, would be the like early forefather to Abraham and then the Jewish people. So they were representative
mm,
of Jewish people, and we see what the text says about uh, Canaan uh, being um, slaves to his brothers, including Shem, right? They thought that Japheth, though, was a forefather to Europeans and white people. So when they see the text saying, I will enlarge the tents of Japheth, and that Canaan would be a slave to his brothers, they thought that this was a prophecy about the white
different
man's
races.
discovery and enslavement of black people. And because
Mm.
Canaan Ham was seen as cursed with black skin, and then given that skin was given to the people of Canaan. And we see how the people of Canaan
And
are seen in the law of in the Mosaic Covenant in the Hebrew Bible. So
yeah,
that didn't go very well.
and yet we don't necessarily know if they had different skin color because they were brothers. So
Yeah, it's a whole thing.
there's there's that, and also, is having black skin a curse? Because I would argue having such incredibly pale skin, it's
It's
not.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I quite
The
like the resistance to the sun that I get.
I would love some resistance to the sun. Like, I'm sure this comes in handy for absorbing vitamin D in the snow, but I don't live in the snow. I live in Australia.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
And yeah, man, it gets it's rough. Like we got to be honest with church history. There's the good, the bad,
mm.
there's ugly, right? There's beautiful. And this is
I
just
do
one of the
have
ugly aspects. I mean, even something as simple as like this
mm,
using Jezebel as a slur. Um
yeah,
you might
the
have heard
Jezebel spirit.
right. Yeah, you might have heard
It's
this in
like,
like hyper charismatic circles and other things like that.
mm,
But the racist white people and slave owners would use that as a slur against black women.
really?
Yeah, yeah, that happened too. So
Okay.
yeah, there was a bunch of different things that uh, occurred for religious reasons, and then again, as we mentioned, we also have the abolition,
Mm,
right? These were people who because the slave owners wanted to argue that if you hold to the authority and the infallibility of scripture, then you should at least not be opposed to slavery or even
mm.
have slaves. And the abolitionists said, "No, I'm a Bible believer,
Mm,
and you're wrong."
yeah.
And so
Which
yeah,
kind of brings me to a question that I thought of as we were talking about things, which is um, abolition of slavery. It seems to be predominantly a Christian idea from like the early days. If you look at Gregory, um, how many other people in the ancient times were even thinking about that or making the argument for that?
it doesn't look like very many people.
Yeah.
um, I mean, Jewish people had slaves for a really long time. I could be wrong here, so obviously fact check me about the things I say. I think
Mm,
Josephus had slaves. The Jewish historian, I believe he had slaves. Um, uh, Second Temple Jews had slaves. Uh, I don't know when Judaism decided that wasn't a good idea anymore, um, or if it was the debate that continued to rage on for a really long time. I mean, I heard this joke.
mm,
I heard this joke, and I think the same thing can be said of Christians, honestly. But I heard this joke where they said that if you get two Jews in a room to debate, you'll have three opinions. So, so maybe there was debated. Like I said, I'm not as versed in that history.
Mm,
As far as I'm aware, Muhammad had slaves, and slept with them, and then talked about uh very much talked about it, and bragged about how he could go through all of those women. Uh, anyway,
yep.
in the hadiths, at least those, you know, whether you want to see them as representative of the prophet or what have you, and
Mm,
whatever you want to do with all of that. I'm not here to like criticize another religion. Is not the point of this video. The point is that it's there, right? Slavery is in all three Abrahamic religions and surrounds the predominant figures of these three main Abrahamic religions. So
mm,
Moses doesn't condemn slavery. Jesus uses slavery in his parables, and right becomes a slave. And then Muhammad also has and sleeps with slaves. So yeah, it's all over the place, and I couldn't really tell you, aside from a Western Christian influence, uh, why that stopped. A similar thing
mm,
for like child marriage.
mm.
There's a decent history of Christians trying to up the minimum age of when women could get married. Sometimes that can be a mixed bag too. There were laws where it's like, okay, she has to be at least 12 years old, um, but
Oh, at least.
yeah, but um, a lot of them tried to up the age for that. And Inspiring
Yeah.
Philosophy on YouTube and his debates and discussions with Muslims, and particularly Daniel Akikachu, who is a modern day defender of child marriage, literally or has made the same point that uh, the Christian church tried to get this done away with, and we
Mm,
see obviously in Western culture that's um, decreasing. It's still actually really prevalent. It's actually a lot, like in the United States, child marriage happens a lot more often than we think. Like in most states
mm.
currently, it is the minimum age is 15 years old.
Right, for
Yeah,
marriage.
yeah. And
Even though
so
the age of, like, consent is 18 in the
well,
US.
the age of consent in a lot of states is 15.
Okay.
Yeah, 15. Yeah,
Hmm.
15 to 16. Yeah. Yeah. Then you have the whole like Romeo and Juliet law where um based on based on this law, like a 21-year-old can uh have relations with a 16-year-old and it not be tried. So that's a whole thing too. So um but yeah, I there are these really there are these institutions and things that have been happening for a really long time in human history.
Hmm,
Um, so and I bring up child marriage just as an example of the fact that it's not super common to have these things challenged in the ancient world. So
yeah.
Gregory of Nyssa is a great voice, and I'm glad he was Christian and motivated by his theology. Gregory the Great, similar
Mm.
thing, but they are pretty lonely voices, it seems.
At the time.
Well, yeah, at the time.
Yeah. It's funny, it kinda reminds me of, there's a writer called Tom Holland, not to be confused with Spider-Man.
Yeah, yeah, this is his book Dominion.
Yeah.
Yeah,
He talks about how, like, the Western world in particular changed very gradually, like, almost glacially over time, but, was essentially very much shaped by Christian ethics.
yeah, yeah, and that's something
Yeah.
that uh, a lot of believing and non-believing people have pointed out. Rodney Stark is a great example of a historian of Christianity who is balanced and honest, and he's not a Christian. Like he says,
Mm,
he, you know, very much incapable of being religious, I believe was his terminology at one point. But you can read his book, Rise of Christianity. Rodney Stark has also talked about slavery and how Christian theology was used,
mm,
even in the 600s, 500s, to fight against slavery. Certain Christians in Asia were fighting against it.
Mm,
So he talks about that in his works. So, like I said, it's a mixed bag, but Christianity has definitely benefited the world. Uh,
mm.
we just haven't always been great people,
Yes.
or the church that we're supposed to be. So
Yeah. I think, one of the difficulties with Christianity is that, it is populated by people,
yeah,
and people have a tendency to suck.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Just a really brief thing about slavery in the Testaments. With regards to the Old Testament and what we see of slavery in the Mosaic Law, I definitely understand why this would give someone pause. I understand why this would make a non-believer out of someone. It's there. It's not
Mm,
challenged. It's pretty much promoted, supported, endorsed, whatever terminology you want to use. It's there. Uh, Not spoken of negatively,
mm.
but
Not, condemned at any rate.
yeah, but uh God, as John Walton has pointed out, God is working within a culture in order to get what he wants accomplished. And as William Webb has pointed out in his argument for redemptive hermeneutic, I think God is you know accommodating the hard hearts of ancient Israel in order to uh, redeem them and to make better people, corporately and individually. And while I wouldn't go full sail into William Webb's redemptive hermeneutic because I think some of his comparisons to the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible are a bit one-sided sometimes. The comparison between the covenants is definitely valid. There is an
Mm.
uptick in the treatment of women and slaves as you go
From
along.
Jesus onwards.
R- Uh, yeah, from Moses to Christ and stuff.
Mm,
And part of that is because of the abolishing of the law of the fulfilling of the law of Moses that Christ does. As a
mm,
result, I mean, you don't have all of those patriarchal passages about, women in marriage and, the test for adultery and Numbers 5
mm.
and all of those things. You don't have a whole bunch of these slave laws. And even if you did, the church can't enforce it in the first century.
No.
Rome is going to enforce their slave laws, and they're not going to care what the church thinks. Uh, so you do see this redemptive uptick in those regards. And with
Mm,
regards to slavery in the New Testament, I would say you don't have a verse that's a rallying cry for the abolition of slavery, but what you do have is inklings, and you do have stuff that you can wield in response to that. Again, receive Onesimus no longer as a slave, but as a
mm,
brother. uh, you know, you have been bought by Christ. Do not become slaves of men. Like that's a very, there's no ambiguity in the Greek there. There is ambiguity in
mm.
that passage in the Greek, but not that specific verse, right?
Right.
Do not become slaves of men. And also further statements like, God desires all to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth, right? God desires
Mhm,
all to be Christians. So, there is this constant question of what do you do with like the non-believing slaves and slave masters?
mm,
Like really, it's abolition for the covenant people because we're special apparently.
mm.
It's not abolition for all everywhere,
Yeah.
but I think the logic of the covenant will lead to that because if if God desires all to be saved and the saved should not be enslaved, then
Mhm.
no one should be enslaved. Right? That's
And
that's that's a
also,
logical that's a perfectly valid logical syllogism.
yeah, and there's also that passage which is, there is no longer male and female in Christ, slave or free in Christ. We're all equal.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, you know, again, limited to the covenant right in Christ, but the covenant is supposed to go out to all people.
It
And
it's
then
supposed to spread.
yeah. And then
Yeah.
again, we also have the image of God, where we're going to argue that ideally, because we're
Mm.
in the image of God and God is our maker, we shouldn't have slaves. Like again, that was not the thinking of the ancient Israelites, and that wasn't always the thinking of the church.
Mm.
But in terms of the church, that was when there was an attempt to abolish slavery, that was often the thinking.
That was, a lot to think about.
Yeah,
A
yeah,
lot of, church history and sort of very deeper philosophical and theological arguments. But, what the original tweet on Twitter said about, um, slavery generally being wrong, but it's good to be a slave of Christ. I think we have upheld that, uh,
yeah.
as Christians, and, um, yeah, so pagans, you have missed the point.
Yes, yeah, and to be fair and to critique my side, I've constantly been annoyed about how Christians have dealt with what we see in the biblical text. I mean,
Mm,
I've seen Christians straight up be like, I mean, yeah, the slavery in the Mosaic Law was good, because God commanded it. No nuance, no nothing like that. Just
yeah,
yeah, you can beat your slave with a rod. I mean, Proverbs talks about that too, where it's like there's a rod for the backs of fools and slaves, and some of these people are like, yeah, I don't have a problem with that. I wouldn't mind being a slave if it meant being under the covenant of Israel. Um,
uh-huh,
so to be fair to the pagan who reposted that tweet, like, again, church history is and Christians can be a mixed bag, but
mm,
we have reason to reject slavery, theologically, morally, and
yeah.
uh, we
In
have
ways which I
reason.
think, like, pagan beliefs don't necessarily,
Mm,
like,
That's I mean, if you don't have this idea of the image of God or this redemptive covenant, then
mm,
theologically speaking, religiously speaking, how do you condemn
yeah.
slavery?
Yeah, it becomes harder for, like, someone who's practicing, like, Norse religions
Mm.
to say, "Oh, no, this is wrong, I have the moral high ground," because my gods were totally into slavery with absolutely no caveats.
Yeah. No, I mean, that is actually interesting. I would love to know um what, because obviously they could have ethical, philosophical objections to slavery, as everyone should.
Mm,
But
yeah.
what specifically religious or theological objections could a pagan have to slavery? That'd be an interesting thing to figure out.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure if anyone's really posed that question to them.
Yeah, no, I'd be interested to figure that out.
Well, if anyone knows the answer to that, or is a pagan who's watching this, go ahead and make your case in the comments. We would be very interested to hear your thoughts. And thank you so much, Izzy, for coming on and giving us a proper scholarly biblical viewpoint of things. I know you've worked incredibly hard on this subject.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I've been diving into this a lot because I really think it matters. It's a big critique against
Mm,
Christianity, and often a point that understandably so shuts up the Christian. Your Bible promotes slavery. I can't believe this. I can't support this.
yeah,
Uh, and that's a very understandable point. But I think given several different theological and moral thoughts within Christianity, we don't have to be worried about this.
yeah. Yes. So thanks everyone for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and let us know your thoughts. I will link all of Izzy's details in the description box and you can check out his stuff. Thanks once again for coming on, for your time. And yeah, we will catch up with everyone soon. You'll be back,
Yeah, yeah.
hopefully.
Nope. That'll be a fun
Yeah.
video.
Yeah, we've got something else in store after this. So makes it sound nefarious, but anyway. All right. See you guys.
Bye.
Bye.